Hello there. Welcome to the live event on human error. Glad that you could join us this morning. We're about T minus 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes. So we're going to give about a couple of more minutes to let anybody else that wants to join us to do so. So if you're live with us, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Looking forward to spending the next few minutes with you. Hopefully we can all grow and learn a few things from it and gain some valuable information that will become actionable items that will eventually help us all to get better. So again, about 3 minutes out, 2.5 minutes or so. Thanks for joining us. Please bear with us to let more folks join in. I'm getting some last minute setup items in order and we will begin momentarily. Trust that everyone is doing all right on this beautiful Tuesday morning. I certainly don't take it for granted the fact that in your incredibly busy schedules, you have set aside these few moments and allowed me to enter your lives via the screen. And hopefully the result of this interaction is going to be beneficial for all of us. So give me another minute or so just to make sure that we have the maximum amount of folks that are going to join us. To do so, while we're setting things up, one more just a setup type of an announcement, and that is the chat option. The chat box is open. Whether you're joining us on YouTube Live or Facebook Live, on LinkedIn Live, all of those forums are open at this particular point. And so please utilize your chat option so that we can see what's going on and we can interact with you that way. So again, another few seconds before we hit 10:30 Central Time on the dot. It is good to see you guys join us and we're starting here momentarily. Make yourself comfortable, get some water, coffee, whatever it takes to get you going this morning. And we'll start here right on the dot at 10:30 Central Standard Time. All right, well, I think that I am just about ready to go. It is 10:30 in the morning, so officially good morning and welcome to this incredible time that we're going to spend together just looking at the issue of human error. It's interesting because no matter what day of the week you end up getting on LinkedIn or looking at the news, and the issue of human error certainly seems to be front and center. We're still talking about it. We're still actually utilizing it as one of our causes when we conduct root cause analysis, whether we do it right or wrong. That tends to be one of the issues that we still go to. So without any further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen and let's go ahead and jump in. Thank you for joining us. I hope that the next few minutes are going to be very beneficial to you, and I hope that you walk away with it learning a few things, hopefully gaining some actionable items. Please utilize your chat feature in whatever online or live interface that you're joining us through, and I will be able to interact with you in that way. So let me go ahead and join my share my screen here for just a moment. All right. We'll go to the PowerPoint slideshow. Okay. All right. So to err is human, a fresh look at human error is what we're going to do over the next few minutes. You know, I've been asking, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I'm your host, Simon Gontrenko. Glad you could join us. I've been asking this question for quite some time now within the different contacts, within the individuals and the organizations that I've interacted with. And I'm curious this morning to find out what you think about this. So use your chat here in a couple of seconds to let me know where you stand on this. Our organization believes human error can be. So type A if you think that your organization believes that human error can be eliminated, and type B in your chat box to think if you believe that human error can be reduced. So I'm curious to know what you're thinking at this particular point. Go ahead and use your chat boxes and let me know some of the responses. All right. So reduced is one of the votes I'm seeing here. Okay. And eliminated. Okay. Let's see. Continue to kind of look at where things are going. Continue. So I'm curious to know what else you guys are thinking. So just give me another second or so and let me know kind of where you're standing on that. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So it's interesting because a lot of the folks that I've talked to are basically telling me that reduced. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So some of you are thinking that it can be reduced and others are thinking that it can be eliminated. All right. So let's look a little bit into this issue and let's dive in a little bit deeper. I think as far as looking at ourselves really and employees that we have in our workplaces, how many of you think that even the best of us make mistakes? Absolutely. I mean, including myself, include yourself. You know, have you made a mistake in the last day, in the last 24 hours, in the last week? And I'm not talking about anything leading to an incredible incident or leading to an injury or anything like that, but just everyday daily mistakes. And here's why: because humans are fallible. That's just part of our nature. There are no perfect human beings yet. I have not seen any human beings that were born on this earth that were perfect. And so even the best of us make mistakes. Even your best employee, take your best employee in your workplace and take that best employee on his or her best day at work. And even on that day, they're liable to make mistakes. It is our nature to be imprecise and to err. And error will happen. And I think that kind of based on the last things that we were looking at, error is unavoidable. It is inevitable. And so just getting that in the back of our minds and getting that clarified, I think in our minds and from our organizational perspective, allows us to see where we need to focus our resources. If we believe and if our organization believes that human error can be eliminated, then we're going to focus all of our energies on eliminating that human error, on getting rid perhaps or replacing these imperfect human beings and replacing them with more perfect ones so that we can eliminate human error. But if we think that human error can be reduced, and if we think that it is unavoidable, if we think that it is inevitable, then wouldn't it be wise for us as an organization to widen our scope? And that's exactly what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. So if we understand that people are fallible, then it goes to reason that no amount of counseling, training, or motivation can alter a person's fallibility. Now, you're saying, yeah, sure, that makes sense. I mean, I totally agree with you. But let's just for a moment consider how that plays out practically. Think about your last incident investigation. Maybe it was an outage, maybe it was an injury, or whatever the incident was. Maybe it was equipment damage. But think about the last investigation that you conducted in your workplace. What was the outcome of the investigation? What were some actionable items that came out of that investigation? Now, a lot of times what we end up doing is we end up blaming, shaming, and retraining. That kind of ends up being the modus operandi for a lot of our investigations. And if that has anything to do, or if any of those parts or anything to the fact of what you had done as far as your last incident investigation, then you have kind of a logical breakdown between understanding that humans are fallible and understanding that no amount of counseling, training, or motivation can alter a person's fallibility. All right, you may say, okay, I'm with you there. What do we do then? What's a better way to manage human error? And so the green square there lets us know that the first step in error management, it's very important for us as managers, for our frontline personnel to understand how and why unsafe acts occur. Understanding how and why unsafe acts occur will help us to then be able to prevent them, right? So that is very, very interesting there. And interestingly enough, and by the way, one thing that I didn't tell you is that as we go through this, I'm going to pause and I'm going to take some questions and I'm going to address your questions. So give me 1 second here. I'm going to respond to some questions here. Just looking at where we stand here. All right. Give me 1 second. I'm having some folks having difficulty logging in, so I'm going to provide the link to this website here. All right. Let's see. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. All right. So just making sure that everybody that wanted to join us can be joining us. So let's see. Let's see. Okay, so someone provided a link. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Chris, for helping out here. Ron, human error is inevitable. Error should be root cause and part of the data to feed back into process loop. Like a jet flying from LA to New York City, continually receiving error feedback, making course corrections, simplified but valid. Very, very good. I agree. Very good point here. And so thank you for responding. Thank you for kind of keeping the conversation going. So back to what we were talking about, understanding how and why unsafe acts occur. And I agree with you, Ron. That's very important. In fact, you're kind of jumping right ahead of what we're going to cover here in a moment. So while we're on the subjects, we're talking about understanding how and why unsafe acts occur. I wanted to put a little plug here. Over the course of the last 5 years, really over the course of the last 25 years, I've been studying human behavior in some way, fashion, or another. And over the last 5 years, I've really taken a deeper dive in the whole area of human performance and human factors. And out of that research, out of that study, out of that observation, and out of that practical applications came out a really very collaborative 2-day course called Human Factors for Critical Environments. It is a deeper dive into human error causes and mitigations. It's a new perspective, a big picture for your C-suite, a new way of thinking for frontline employees, and providing practical tools and tips for both levels of the work culture. It paves kind of the way for the systemic buy-in. So here's the information on the screen. If you want to talk a little bit more about it, I'd love to talk to you more about it after this. But I wanted to put the plug in because of what we talked about a second ago, and that is that understanding how and why unsafe acts occur is the first step. So if you want help with your first step, please let me know afterwards. But let's talk for a moment about some sources of human error. There are at least 2 different sources in any of our workplaces. There's the industrial plant, and that's your frontline operations, whether they're working around, whether it's an oil and gas location and there are all kinds of hazards there, or whether it's a data center location where you have electricity and other hazards potentially there in the workplace. But there's also another source that we often don't consider being the source of human error, and that's the paper plant. What's the paper plant, you may ask? Well, glad you asked. That's your policies, that's your rules, that's your procedures, that's your SOPs, your MOPs. And we often think, well, we put our best people on this. We put some of our brightest minds on this. So that certainly isn't the case, but it is. Situations change, our policies get updated, and a lot of times, even if we have the best management of place procedures in place, sometimes things get mixed up, and so there is a disconnect. If you talk to the guys on the floor, a lot of times they will have a lot of opinions and a lot of thoughts to share with you about what they think about some of the policies that were written, being disconnected from sort of the way we practically do this. And so the industrial plant and the paper plant, and by the way, a lot of your flaws and a lot of your latent errors, we'll talk about that in just a moment, happens to be on the paper plant. And those are at least two different sources of human errors. By the way, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them through the chat box, and I'll take a moment here and there and interact with you a little bit. So there are these things we're talking about, causes of human error. And by the way, if we decided from the very beginning of this presentation a couple of minutes ago that humans are fallible, and if that is what you believe, in fact, that humans are fallible, and by the way, if you don't believe that, just come out to where I am and follow me for a little bit. Even as someone who has researched this for many years and decades and have looked into this and understands all this, there's still a disconnect every once in a while. And so with that in mind, though, I think still, based on reasons, error causation diagram that you have in the background of this slide, if we understand that humans are fallible, then wouldn't it be wise for us to work on closing not just the human fallibility gap, as is represented by one of the slices of Swiss cheese, but to also look at other gaps where we can further enforce the protective measures that our organization has. Because if we know that this one, we can't ever fully and completely close, we can never fully and completely eliminate the fallibility of humans, wouldn't it make sense then to go ahead and close the other gaps as well? And so one of those other gaps, and as we're talking about the human fallibility, is these error-likely situations. What are error-likely situations? Well, see, these things are actually predictable and manageable and preventable. I'm going to give you an example of an error-likely situations. We can predict, for example, every year we cross into the new year. We can predict that a person writing a personal check at the beginning of a new year stands a pretty good chance at writing the previous year on the check. Okay, so that's an error-likely situation. And a similar prediction can be made within the context of work at the job site. So you recognize these error traps. You communicate hazards. And by the way, talking about error traps, I'm curious. This may be the concept that, you're joining us on LinkedIn Live right now or on Facebook Live or YouTube, and you're going, you know what, I know all of this stuff. So I'm curious about those of you, and I'm curious for those of you who do know this stuff. I have a question for you. What are some of the examples of error traps in your workplaces that you have? Can you think about it? Have you identified these error traps in your context? Share with me via chat if you can. What are some of the examples of these error traps that you have in your organizations? Any thoughts, any ideas? And while you're doing that, I'll give you another idea. Back right after World War II in the late 40s, 1940s, one of the other examples of error traps, there was a large data dump coming in from all of these airline pilots or military pilots that were landing the aircraft, and they were having crashes after landing. And so a military colonel, an Air Force colonel, I cannot remember his name off the top of my head, actually started investigating and pulling some data and researching. And one of the things that he found was an error trap. In a standard cockpit, the controls for landing gear and the controls for flaps were located right next to each other. They looked the same, and there was no standardization between different cockpits as to what side of each other they were on. And so that was a perfect example of an error trap. We created a situation where right upon landing, instead of pulling the flaps, opening the flaps, the pilots were retrieving the landing gear and the planes were collapsing on their side. So that's a perfect example of an error trap, okay? And so, again, whether you answer the question right now or not, one of the things that you can take away with you from this conversation is, what are my error traps? What are our organizational error traps? And so the next time an incident happens, and I hope it doesn't, but if it does, or maybe you have a near miss, which is really the best case scenario that you're investigating. And by the way, I hope you are. We'll talk in a moment about the importance of gaining information, gathering data from the near misses. They're really your best saving grace as far as the inflow of data without any serious or significant consequences. And so as you're gathering data, if you're looking at the data that you're getting, perhaps prior to immediately jumping in and blaming whoever the person that happened to be at the sort of the sharp end of whatever happened, perhaps you think, well, was the situation that he or she was in, was that an error trap? Could it have been, could we have set him up in a perfect error trap situation? And so back to your point, Ron, earlier that you made about communicating, ongoing communication of hazards. And that's a very important part of this overall systematic prevention of errors in an organization is continual communication of hazards, actively and continually. It has to be done well. Our people have to know. Our people have to be aware and ready and prepared and constantly looking to see what new data input is coming in about the new hazards that are in the workplace. That's why, we talk about one of the great sources, one of the great methods that this communication can be created is your pre-job quick meet. No matter what shift it is, no matter what time of day it is, when you have a pre-job briefing, that's a very important time when you can pass on this communication. You can communicate the new things that have arisen in your facility, and that process needs to be continual. It needs to be standardized. It needs to be something that is expected. But not only communicate, because communicating new hazards is really only half of the game, right? The next thing that you need to do is you need to have controls in place as far as your organization is concerned, where the things that need to be adjusted, the controls that need to be adjusted, they're being adjusted proactively on an ongoing basis. It's not a once a year, let's do our annual audit of the facility to see what needs to happen. It needs to be, as much as the information is coming in, there needs to be ways to adjust proactively and constantly closing these gaps. Because see, unlike your slices of Swiss cheese, when you go to the grocery store and you go to the deli counter and you slice some slices of Swiss cheese, you get them in the bag, you get home, it's all good. You open the bag, the slices and the holes in Swiss cheese kind of remain in the same spot. In our organizations, these holes are constantly opening and closing, and they're constantly moving. And so when the holes, the open holes and the hazards kind of line up in a perfect ways, that's when an incident happens. So it's very important for us to be, just as Ron said, a culture of open collaboration. It is very critical, but not just open collaboration, but also being willing, being ready, and being always prepared to constantly close those gaps. All right, good. So we talked about error likely situations. Let's talk about what are some of the things that are causing in terms of human capabilities. When we exceed the limits of human capabilities, that's what increases the likelihood of error in our workplaces. Fatigue, for example, is one of those. Especially with this global pandemic, we're working longer hours now than a generation ago, and we're sleeping less. Our physical, mental, and emotional fatigue can lead to error and poor judgment, okay? Fatigue is affected also, we got to remember, by both on-the-job demands, right, which is, COVID and all the new requirements that we have in our workplaces associated with the pandemic, production pressures, environment, reduced staffing. I have friends that work for one of the big 5 technology giants that for the last year, they've operated under reduced staffing. And what that creates is it increases their fatigue because the workload has not decreased. If anything, it has actually increased but the staffing has decreased. And so that's a perfect recipe for fatigue, which again is an air precondition there. But also fatigue can also be caused by off the duty lifestyle. That's one of the things that most of our health and safety personnel, most of our health and safety training, most of our on the job training, we don't really think about it much. And that's why it's so important. By the way, that's why you really do want to consider the possibility of bringing this 2-day training that I was talking about earlier to your workplaces, because it opens a lot of doors in your minds that we don't normally consider in the course of our day-to-day operations, such as how does my off-duty diet, how did what I eat for lunch today, how are my sleep habits impacting my ability to do critical operations, my ability to make critical decisions? And so fatigue leads to impaired reasoning and decision making, impaired vigilance and attention, slowed mental functioning and reaction time, loss of situational awareness, and adoption of shortcuts. You got to understand something about shortcuts. Really don't want to go too far into detail here, but your brain, my brain, human brain, is designed to constantly look for ways to conserve energy. What does that mean? Well, specifically and practically, that means that it is constantly looking to make shortcuts. Okay, so we talk about the importance of not getting complacent, the importance of not taking shortcuts. Well, it's a constant uphill battle. Most of our employees don't realize that. And so just understanding that allows you to know some of the ways to mitigate that. Then you have, again, loss of situational awareness. You have stress. How many of you are stressed? Right here, you see this hand? Very much so. Last year has brought the kinds of stress that we didn't even know existed into our world, right? And so what stress does when you're entering or you're approaching a situation where you have to make a critical decision, stress actually, science tells us, shrinks human brain. And what it does is in doing so, what stress does is it makes you feel, right, like you have fewer choices available to you. But it also makes you feel at the same time, what stress does is it also makes you feel like your time allowance, your time availability is much more limited than it actually is. Perfect recipe for disaster, right? And so we need to be aware of that, and our employees need to be aware of that. William, I agree with you. Educating employees at all levels is very, very important as far as knowing, and we're actually going to talk about more of a systematic view of this. There are also memory lapses. Our human memory can only handle so much at the same time. And so I think it's very, very interesting and important to remember that memory lapses can impact, especially if you've got something going on. Significant impairment can very definitively exceed the limits of human capabilities. When are we significantly impaired? Well, when we work in a kind of environment where we come to work and we're not feeling the greatest, we don't feel the freedom to actually take some time off because we're afraid it's going to impact our employment. And so we come to work impaired, and that significant impairment affects our judgment as well. And it can affect and very quickly exceed the limits of human capability. Michael, not only educating them, but giving them a voice to have input in not only the discovery, but the corrective measures. Very good point. That has to do with the reporting culture. And actually, I'm going to touch on that in just a moment. Very good point, Michael. I agree with that 100%. Limited attention resources. That's another way that our human capabilities can be very quickly exceeded very quickly, almost momentarily. Distraction, we talk about distractions all the time, but how many of you recognize that, when I come to work and I have personal issues going on, maybe I have trouble with the family, maybe I have trouble with my kids, maybe I am a very good employee, an excellent employee, but I just have, I'm doing some continual education, I'm taking some classes online, and right now is crunch time. Right now is finals week. Right now, I'm having to turn in my research papers and I'm having to turn in all my assignments. And so that actually taking a good amount of my mental focus and my attention to where when I come into work and I'm ready to do critical tasks, my attention resources are very limited. Okay, very important to remember that. One of the ways to mitigate that is self-checking. Stop, think, act, review. That's an effective tool for maintaining attention. Mindset. What's a mindset? Well, psychologists will tell us that people see what the mind expects or wants to see. And so what happens is we ignore anything outside that mental model, right? People tend to miss conditions and circumstances which are not expected. This conceals hazards and leads to inaccurate perception of risks. So how do you mitigate that? Pre-job briefings, if those are done mindfully, as we talked about that already, they help people recognize what needs to be avoided as well as what needs to be accomplished. So that's a very interesting thing. But the other interesting thing I wanted to point out to you that I think is something you guys know very well is this whole difference between active and latent errors, right? And I'm going to pause for a second. Vlad, we eliminate punitive culture in order to facilitate healthy feedback from our employees. Instead of concentrating on punishing, we'll look for the ways to avoid those critical issues. That is so important, Vlad. And in fact, in just a moment, I'm going to have a slide that deals exactly with that. The whole idea of just culture is what you're bringing up, and you are making an excellent point there. We'll definitely touch on that, and I'm looking forward to getting some more feedback on that from you, because I think you're bringing up a really good point. But let's consider for just a moment the difference between active and latent errors. What's an active error? Well, I mean, we all know an active is an observable physical action that changes equipment, system, or facility state. It may change a person's state, personal state. It brings immediate undesirable circumstances. An active error, okay? We all know what an active error is. But a latent error is a hidden organization-related weakness or equipment flaw that lies dormant. Hidden or latent errors are very difficult to prevent. They don't fade away. They just accumulate in a system over a period of time. Let me give you some examples of latent errors, because those are a little bit more difficult for us to kind of think of or to bring up. We can have weaknesses in processes or inefficiencies, or maybe we have design defects. There may be manufacturing defects, maybe maintenance failures, defective tools, inaccurate procedures, policies, inaccurate drawings, confusing equipment nomenclature. I actually came across some equipment in some of the facilities that I visited and audited over the years where the same piece of equipment actually has 2 or 3 different nomenclature numbers on it. And so if that piece of equipment, something happens to it, if it goes offline and an employee wants to alert whoever needs to be alerted very quickly because it's a critical piece of equipment about this particular piece of equipment, which nomenclature is he going to use? The top, the bottom? So that can be a very quick and a very confusing thing that can bring a delay in bringing this piece of equipment back online. Again, just a confusing equipment nomenclature, double nomenclature, latent error. It can be our employees inadvertently or unknowingly altering the integrity of physical facility equipment, such as maybe installing an incorrect gasket, maybe mispositioning a valve, or hanging a danger tag in a wrong place, or attaching an incorrect label. All of these are examples of latent errors. And thank you, William, for Drift into Failure. I recommended a good book. I think I like that one very much, and I appreciate your input on that. And one thing that we need to understand is that kind of over the course of conducting these investigations and doing a further research in the field, it's interesting because majority of errors associated with incidents in our workplaces stem from actually latent conditions. And a lot of times, unless we do a really good job of investigating these, we don't recognize the latent conditions that led to that. And we only focus on the active error, and we try to blame and shame and retrain the individual at the sharp end of an active error while not recognizing that maybe there's a whole host of other individuals at the latent side of it that have contributed to this error for quite some time. Context, and that kind of brings me to the whole host that I was talking about. That's context. And the people, the picture on the slide is not accidental. I searched high and low, just trying to find a really good illustration of an organizational context, because people cannot perform better than the organization supporting them. Okay, work is achieved in our workplaces within the context of the organizational processes, culture, and management planning and control systems. So we can tell our employees to go out there and do the best work that they can, to go out there and be individual, to go out there and express their individuality, and so on and so forth. But fact of the matter is these employees are still going to function within the organizational context that we've developed for them. So I'm going to give you some of the examples of the organizational factors that sort of sometimes hem in, if you will, sometimes sort of hold in our employees. One of them is cleanliness of the work environment, right? So I remember a few years back showing up to do my normal routine audit of a facility, and this happened to be in the state of Oklahoma. And as I walked through that facility, I realized very quickly that the cleanliness of the work environment was not exactly on par with all the other facilities that I'd seen before. But see, these employees that operated within this facility, it was the kind of the organizational expectations. They never saw the completely perfect, the spotless facilities that I had seen. And so they were limited as far as raising above that organizational culture. That's just one of the examples of that. Staffing levels is another organizational factor. I mentioned some of the top 5 technology leaders, such as Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, over the last year, just interacting with some of the personnel from these organizations. A lot of them have operated with decreased staffing. And so that's an organizational factor, if you will, that will really contribute to the work being done. I'm in the state of Texas, and I've interacted with some employees from the Texas Department of Corrections. They're experiencing, connected to this coronavirus, they're experiencing tremendous staffing shortages right now. So much so that the current employees within the Texas Department of Corrections are sometimes scheduled to work 16-hour shifts. I mean, that is a very tricky situation, because you're putting a limit, you're causing fatigue, and you're creating an error-likely situation. Another organizational factor can be an experience level of the workforce, or management visibility. Interestingly enough, error rates decrease when managers or supervisors are in the field with workers. So I have a question for you. If you're a manager, if you're a supervisor, if you have a manager in your title, right? So here's a question for you. When was the last time you were in the field? When was the last time you visited those supervisors that are under you, and those line employees, frontline employees that are under you? That's something that's very important for us to keep our finger on the pulse of our workplaces. But what's interesting too is I have another question, and this kind of helps you to maybe evaluate or just something to consider as far as your context, your organizational context. Here's a question for you. When production and protection, and that's another word for safety, conflict in your workplace, which prevails? Something worth considering, right? Because let me tell you something. When managers place importance on what is considered high priority, it becomes valued in the organization, whether it's publicly espoused or not. Let me give you an example. One of the organizations that I worked in the oil and gas field in the past, explicitly in the public arena, talked about how much they wanted to improve their safety. But implicitly, behind the scenes, the top leaders of the organization torpedoed the establishment of safe culture every step of the way. They encouraged opposition to safety. They provided alcohol for on-the-job consumption, and they resisted informational campaigns and frustrated safety training efforts every step of the way. So my question to you, what do you think the employees, the average employees that have been there and that beyond and above everything else just wanted to keep their job, what message do you think they got out of that? You're absolutely right. It's the production that matters. Safety, protection does not matter. When production and protection conflict in that workplace, production always trumped protection. And here's another question for senior management. What are your organization's current human performance challenges? If you are completely and totally disconnected from that, if that is something that you leave for your safety department, maybe it's time for you to consider, just in doing that, in your quiet, tacit disassociation from that, what message are you saving or sending to the rest of the organization? Just something worth considering. Here's a formula then, as we're kind of talking about it. We've spent a good amount of time talking about human error, but really, I think what you're realizing as we've talked about it, and you guys are relating it, the same idea in comments as well. I appreciate all of the comments that you've provided here. The reduction of incidents, 0 incidents on the right side of the equation, really does take both the reduction of error, that's RE, but also management of control. So we want to reduce human error. We want to educate, train, just like you guys said, inform, empower, right, our employees. But we also want to, on top of that, for a more systematic approach, manage controls that we have in place. And that translates to those different slices of Swiss cheese that we looked at in Reason's diagram just a moment ago. So what does system approach look like when it comes to just our thinking, when it comes to the way that some practical implications of that, our thinking process? So, well, first of all, when you have a systematic approach to error reduction, then the average person, the average employee thinks I'm responsible for my own safety and the safety of others. I am my brother's keeper. That's kind of the mental process. Every time that I would host any kind of risk management, safety related call in any of the organization that I've worked, I would always ask them, or consulted with, I would always ask them a question. And it's sort of a trick question, they recognized as such, but I would ask, who's responsible for safety in your workplace? And those that kind of didn't consider what I was asking or didn't see where I was going with that would sometimes initially say, or Johnny or Billy or Bob or Michelle or whoever it was that was their organization's top health and safety officer. And then I would pause them and I would say, I think that's not the right answer. I think the right answer is that I'm responsible and you're responsible. We're all responsible. And that is, I think, one of the ways that we have to change the mindset of our people. Organizational systems and processes provide mechanisms to identify these systematic weaknesses and assure adequate controls. What are these mechanisms? Well, one of those, as you guys pointed out, is reporting mechanisms. It's very important for us to encourage and to be able to benefit from the reporting from our employees. And the thing that we can, the best way to encourage that reporting is to systematically integrate safety into management and work processes. In other words, if you get feedback, if you get your personnel, your line employees, your shop level personnel actually talking to you, actually providing input, actually providing recommendations, actually reporting hazards, the worst thing that you can do is do nothing about it. Do not act on it. If you don't, you will, that's the quickest way to discourage in reporting and shutting down those information inputs, which is really about the worst thing that you can do as far as your safety culture is concerned. And that, of course, leads me to the next point, and that is this whole idea of continuous learning and improvement. It has to be a continuous part of the culture. In fact, here's another way of putting that. Each and every one of our organizations, the best, and this is what I was talking about earlier that I was getting to, each and every one of our organizations, what we want to get to is the top level of the pyramid, right? We want to get to the safe culture, because once we get to the safe culture, we understand that there is an automatic integration of safe thinking, right? In all of our processes, in all of our decisions, in our procedures, in our policies, in our SOPs, safety mindset is integrated in that. How do we get to that? Well, guess what? It starts with the just culture. That's back to your point, Vlad, that you made earlier in the call. It starts with a just culture. What's a just culture? Well, just culture is not, like I said, blaming, shaming, and retraining. It's not just continually and constantly retributive culture, just practicing retribution for everything that happens by punishing the one that happens to be at the sharp end, at the active error, but recognizing that it takes a whole lot more than just that one individual to actually get to that point. What is just culture? Sidney Dekker has done a lot of work on the just culture, and he's a really good resource that I recommend for you to look up. And in fact, he wrote a book called Just Culture. You might want to look it up and read and learn it because it's very helpful. You see, just culture, the cool thing about just culture is that it actually opens the door for you to have a reporting culture. No employees of yours, no employees of ours are going to want to report anything that is potentially self-incriminating, if you will, if they know that, or the result of that report, they might get fired. They might get brought in to bear responsibility. Now, so if you have a just culture established as opposed to a blaming culture, then you promote reporting culture. And people all of a sudden provided some degree of anonymity, perhaps, and some degree of not retributive justice constantly, some degree of protection from that. Maybe there's a degree of separation between those individuals that read the reports and those individuals that decide what needs to be done. There are lots of ways to do that, and Sidney Dekker certainly has really good advice for that. But the just culture opens the door for reporting culture. You cannot get to the informed culture without having the reporting culture. If your employees are not constantly providing the data input into what's going on, you're not an informed culture. And you can only be a flexible culture when you are informed. There's no way to be flexible when you don't know what's really going on. And then the learning culture is a result of a flexible culture because you're trying new things. You're constantly taking input. You're adjusting. You're self-adjusting. You're reevaluating. You're tweaking here, the direction there. And when you have built these precursors to the safe culture, when you have that, you can have a safe culture in your workplace. There really is no, for those of you that have done any type of health and safety work in any organization for any number of years, I think you know and understand when I say this, there is no shortcuts to safe culture. There's no magic formula. There's no magic shortcut, a quick, bypass to where you get. It has to build slowly. It has to build over time. And so that's very, very important. And it is exactly to the point of what you guys were saying. And in fact, when you have this safe culture, part of the understanding of this safe culture is this organizational cognizance, awareness that no matter how boring I may think my job is, no matter how mundane I think the next shift is going to be, because you see, I'm operating within the data center environment, for example, where nothing ever really happens. I do the same things. I do my rounds and I do my readings and I do my, maybe I'm taking a vendor around and so on and so forth. It's a very routine task, but an organization that has a systematic approach to error reduction understands and has a pervasive thinking, has succeeded in pervasively impacting their employees with this understanding. There is no such thing as a routine task or a routine job. Their research tells us that high reliability organizations, those that have less than their fair share of incidents in their workplaces, are those that have this constant awareness and constant preoccupation with what could happen next. And that is one of the secrets to them having less than their fair share of incidents. So there's no such thing as a routine task. In conclusion, I just want to set one last thing, and I want to give you one last example just from our daily life of what a system approach looks like as far as our daily life is concerned. For example, let's look at fire protection in our homes, okay? So we begin the process of fire protection by utilizing, on the bottom right of the slide, you see we utilize fire-resistant building materials, right? We use brick, we use cement blocks sometimes, we use metal or tile roofs, we use steel doors sometimes. Indoors, we use sheetrock walls and ceilings. We use ceramic tile floorings and so on and so forth. So that's the first step, is we use the fire-resistant building materials, okay? But we don't stop there. That's just one of the slices of Swiss error causation, Swiss cheese analysis of error causation. That's just the first slice there, our fire-resistant building materials. But we also utilize, right in the middle of your slide there on top, we have ground fault interrupter circuit breakers, okay, the GFI circuit breakers. And these automatically cut off electricity when they sense shorts and circuits. So we have these in critical places around the house installed even as we're building. Then we also installed smoke detectors and alarm that warn us of danger should a fire start. And then we also, on top of that, another slice of Swiss cheese, we provide fire extinguishers. And on top of that, we have local firefighters that are additional controls that contain and put out fire. So that's just an example of one. I mean, we have the same type of a system approach when it comes to our driving, for example. It's another example of the same type of a thing. You know, we have speed limits as one of the controls. Driver's licenses is another control. We have those perforated parts of the highway and the sides of the highway that start making noise when tires come in contact with them to alert us to stay in the lane. A lot of our vehicles have lane change notifications where we get alerts from our vehicle when we change lanes, and so on. You know, you have a lot of your newer vehicles have a yellow light that comes on somewhere in the dashboard or in your side mirror that tells you that there is someone in your blind spot. So we have lots of different slices, again, when it comes to driving, when it comes to fire protection. And I think it's time for those of our organizations that do not have similar approach to reduction of error to consider a similar approach. So something for you to take home with you. What are these systems that maybe you need to put in place? What are these controls that you need to put in place in order to compensate for the fact of what we started with, the fact that people are fallible, and the fact that mistakes are unavoidable and they're going to happen? So that's something for you to think about, something for you to take home, and that is kind of the bulk of what I want to talk about. I didn't want to talk the entire time. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to, for just a moment, stop sharing here, and what I'm going to do is give you guys an opportunity to ask me any other questions that you may have. Okay, so I'm opening the chat here for just another moment, seeing if you guys have any other thoughts or questions. I'll put my phone number and my email address on the screen for you. Hopefully you can see that, so that you can be able to get in touch with me. Again, if you want to talk a little bit more on any of these issues, I know I've just touched on some of these issues, and we could probe a lot further and talk a lot more. And or if you want to talk a little bit further about bringing this very collaborative and fun 2-day training. Some of you guys that have joined us on this live session have been through some of the training that I've done, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. So feel free to comment about that in chat box as well. So again, any other questions, any other thoughts? I'm going to be around for just another moment or two to entertain that and see if I can help with anything else that you guys may have. And if we do not have any other questions or thoughts or comments here, then we'll go ahead and close this. Again, you have my phone number, 936-701-1176 is the number that you can get in touch with me on. And the email address is info@safeguardsol. Safeguard Solutions is my company, info@safeguardsol.com. Please write that down, take a picture, take a screenshot, and so that you can get in touch with me if you need any further information. Any last minute thoughts? Any last minute comments? You guys have been a great audience. I appreciate your participation. I've seen some great chat interaction, and enjoyed interacting with you guys. Enjoyed the questions that have come in. Hopefully I've addressed them as we've kind of gone on. Again, thank you for your time. We've been together now for 50 minutes. I think I'm going to spend another second or two and go ahead and close it out. So again, thanks so much, guys. I appreciate it. Enjoyed spending time with you. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have any other questions. we're ending this stream now. Have a great day. And remember, systematic approach to the reduction of error. I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.